Okay, now recording. Welcome, everyone. Today we have a guest speaker to kick us off. So, Josh Cohen, you'll recall it was one of our co-authors on the Office study that you all read in the first week. And he's also done some really interesting research into nostalgia. So, given the amount of interest in this topic we had in the first couple weeks of discussion, I asked him if he would come and share a little bit more. So we'll spend about the first 30 minutes or so. I'll just turn it over to Josh, and then we will resume our normal discussion after that.
All right. Thank you, Perry. I appreciate you inviting me here. And I have a just a short slide deck. I don't know if I can share my screen if that's okay.
Of course, you should be able to.
All right. So yeah, well, like what Perry said, part of my dissertation, I dealt with nostalgia as a part of social surrogacy, the way that media, social surrogacy of media, the way that media can help us in dealing with different social issues we may have over time, such as rejection, loneliness, isolation. And part of that was nostalgia. And so I'm just going to take a few minutes and talk about nostalgia. And it's a complex construct that has received more attention in the last 20 years or so. But by no means is it saturated. By no means it is still there's still a lot of questions to be answered in regard to nostalgia, and especially when you put it in reference of different media. So just a brief history, very brief history of nostalgia, and it has an interesting history, like many things, because of the perspective, the original perspective of psychology. Nostalgia started as something more of like an illness, actually. It was an illness coined by the um, uh, physician, German physician, Johannes Hofer in his 1688 dissertation. And this is the first time this word is mentioned. It was eventually moved into pop culture as things do. But through the years, so it started off as an illness, mainly soldiers experienced when they spent a long time away from home, fighting in battles. They were away from their families. But through the years, it transitioned not to just the soldiers, but individuals who never were a soldier on the battlefield. And it just represented it's still an illness, but like a homesickness type of illness that people would have melancholy, sleeplessness, and anxiety. About the mid 20th century, clinicians reduced the severity of nostalgia, though, realizing that sufferers mainly just had a longing to return to maybe a time or place in their lives. And then Sedekis in 2008. Fast forward quite a bit, like I said, very brief. There's so much more here, obviously, but define nostalgia as a sentimental longing for one's past, and even that is really very general. We're going to get more specific when we talk about media here uh, in this presentation. The definition does not explain the breadth and characteristics and triggers of nostalgia, which we're going to get into more specifics here in a few minutes. And so I wanted to talk about some specific things that nostalgia must entail in order to have that, in order to have a nostalgic reminiscence, if you will. First of all, nostalgia involves memory and imagination. And nostalgia requires narrative self-referencing in one's life story. And so cognitive scientist Jerome Bruner, 1991, asserted the narrative construction of reality. And this referred to the way in which humans organize, send, and receive stimuli in a narrative framework. We do this unconsciously, and we are always adding to and taking away the our internal story, the story we tell ourselves, so to speak. Again, this is not something consciously done. This is unconscious. And he said that one aspect, and there were several, but the one aspect here we're going to talk about related to memory and imagination is this idea of referentiality, an aspect of this idea of the narrative construction of reality. When we see a story or read a story, see a story in TV or movies, it has to, although it's fictional, it has to have uh, a reference of truth to it, as to have it has to feel true to us in a sense. We talked about suspension of disbelief, how that we for a limited time we will kind of let our disbelief down, our guard down in the sense, yeah, okay, again, not maybe consciously but unconsciously, as we get transported into the story. There's a referencing that happens though. And it happens because the story has elements of referentiality to it. It doesn't matter. So like, doesn't matter if it's a story with aliens in it, and it's like really far-fetched. Referentiality refers to, okay, they're aliens, but the the conflict they're going to get into is going to be a very similar conflict to the things you deal with in your life, and the dialogue will be similar. And this helps us reference. If not, these stories would be completely ridiculous to us. We would not spend time with them. Stories where we cannot see ourselves are stories we don't want to have anything to do with. And so there is a referentiality to stories and storytelling that must be there. A good example that from an older TV excuse me, an older TV show now is from the Golden Girls, Sophia, played by Stella Getty. If you know the um, program, she is the eldest of the group, and she often doles out her wisdom by referring to the past. Her catchphrase was "Picture it, Sicily," and she'd give a date in 1912 or whatever, and she would tell a story, and she would tell a story so that it conveyed a particular meaning, and so she would do that in the show. It's funny, my daughter is 23. She just discovered the Golden Girls a few years ago. She was 19 years old when she started watching the Golden Girls, one of her favorite shows now. She rewatches it. And this is one of the things she'll do this. She'll say, picture it, and she'll say, give the setting just like Sophia did, as that catchphrase. And so she dispenses wisdom to her housemates by recalling stories from her childhood and young adulthood in Sicily. And this narrative self-reference is what I'm talking about. She placed herself in the narrative in her memories to recall these helpful humorous stories that she would tell. And they all had a time, a place, and events, and they were told from her perspective. And this is what we do with stories. Nostalgia involves memory, but also imagination, because nostalgia, as we're going to get to here in a bit, it changes things around a bit, or makes things easier to remember, or helps us to connect with our own self-concept, as we will see. Narrative also involves emotion. This means that although a story may be fiction, there's as we said, a ring of truth to it, and the 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 events of the story will either have like a positive or negatively balanced emotion to it. It can be positive, or you can remember something that is really positive, cause positive memories, or remember something that caused negative memories. It doesn't always be positive to be nostalgic, for example. And the so like for example, the final season of The Office, if you're familiar with the show, uh, Jim and Pam have been married for a few years now, and she questions some of her decisions, and some of what they've done and things like that. And he gives her a DVD to watch to answer all of her questions and to help her kind of figure out where they're at in their relationship. And the DVD, he asked the fictional documentary crew to put together a DVD of like kind of like the highlights of their relationship. And she's watching the DVD, of course, crying at all of the wonderful times they've had and all the great again mainly positively but some negatively balanced events or emotions connected to these events. And she watches it, she's overcome with emotion, and that's designed for both her and the audience uh to again retell the story very quickly and to remind the audience of all those high points that we watched, all those high points in their relationship that they high points and low points that they got through. They spent time together and they're still together, and the relationship had longevity. And it all kind of came together in order to kind of be this emotional message to her saying that, they've made the right choices, that he wasn't upset that he stayed in Scranton, if you know the storyline, or whatever. And it's meant to elicit emotion from the viewers as well. Myself personally, I can't get through watching this episode or this part of the episode without, the invisible ninjas cutting onions showing up. It's just, just seeing that. But the thing is, I don't have the same relationship with my wife that Jim has with Pam. We don't have the same story at all. We didn't meet at work. There's really there's no connection whatsoever, other than seeing seeing this DVD and seeing how long they've been together, the things they went through. It makes me think of my own, again, going back to memory and imagination. It makes me think of my own relationship with my own wife, and it produces emotion. We also remember that the nostalgia we exhibit will be based on the unique balance between nostalgia proneness and our penchant for new experiences. So in my dissertation, I measured, excuse me, nostalgia proneness, which is not nostalgia specifically, but our penchant to be nostalgic. And everyone is different in that based on your personality, your age, your life stage. And there are just some people, like I said, personality wise, there are some people that might not, although nostalgia is universal, seen in, countries around the world, has been observed in research in countries around the world. Uh, the the amount of proneness you are to nostalgia will differ from person to person. Some people will be more apt, more going after new experiences than experiencing nostalgic experiences, and this may change over a person's lifetime. So you have to remember that it's going to be different for everybody, but it is universal. Nostalgia involves our identity, and this is in line with consistency theory, that we were going to always want to feel consistent with ourselves. Our self-concept will be consistent with our values and what we do and what we think. Nostalgia helps us avoid cognitive dissonance in areas related to self-concept. Nostalgia makes us feel good about ourselves because we feel consistent with ourselves. That's kind of like the sweet part or the bittersweet part of nostalgia. It makes us feel good because we feel consistent with ourselves. And just like Joseph Campbell said, you are the hero of your own story. Well, more to the point, you're the protagonist of your story. Sometimes you feel like the hero. Sometimes you feel like you're the villain of your own story, that you may be hurting yourself. There's conflict in yourself, that you're doing something wrong, and that you're hurting your chances, or you're hurting your own uh happiness sometimes. But in the end, we're the protagonists, always of our own story. And so nostalgia helps us to be consistent with ourselves, our self-identity. In the sequel, Inside Out 2, just came out recently. I haven't watched it yet. It's in my queue to watch. But there's a character actually in this one called Nostalgia, who's pictured as an older woman who constantly reminisces about the past. And I get why they did that. I think it's a mischaracterization, personally, but I get why they did it, because they figure, well, older people, they've lived longer and they have more to remember, and they always kind of want to talk about the past. That's not really what nostalgia is. Instead, nostalgia is a workhorse constantly editing our memories to fit within our self-concept. It's not the only editor that we have, but it's one of the editors that we have, the cognitive editors, you might say, that's always trying to fit our memories within our self-concept. And so with that, I'd like to just talk about the types of nostalgia related to media. And this came up kind of organically uh, in my research, both in my uh, limited qualitative research that I did in my qualitative research class before I started my dissertation, and also just in my dissertation research, I found out about the different types of nostalgia that can be experienced by people in regard to media. This list by no means is exhaustive. Like I said, there needs to be much more research done. But or I should say also, nostalgia doesn't happen like in a static situation. It's fluid. And it can be mixed with other emotions as you're experiencing it. So the first thing is media can remind us of real places. We can have nostalgic reminiscences of real places, even though we see it on the screen. If we have experienced a real place before, we have either lived or visited, we can be reminded of that place. For example, television shows that are set in cities such as New York or Boston, doesn't have to be a big city, it could be a small town or what have you. Those establishing shots, because most of them aren't really filmed there. They're filmed in California, but those establishing shots of the cities in which these TV shows or movies are filmed can promote nostalgia, can make us feel, again, like draw us home or draw us to a certain time, a place in our life, or to a certain event that happened in that place. And then media can remind us of fictional places. Places do not have to be real to to remind us of them and to make us feel like we want to go there. And that's a great news if you're in the amusement park business. Uh, so, for example, the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, this place never really existed, of course, yet people feel nostalgic to both to seeing it on screen and in real life. There are places that they have reconstructed this where you can go and sit on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. And so people go to these places and to experience them. There's actually been what I found is there's been a really an uptick in tourism related to nostalgic places seen in media in the past decade or so, and it continues to rise. People will go to New York City to stand on the street corner. The previous slide where their restaurant, it was called Monk's on Seinfeld. It's actually called Tom's in real life. But they'll go to stand on that street corner, take a picture, or they'll go to where Central Perk was supposed to be in New York or from friends, and they will go to these places. And this is happening more and more, where also for promotion or for profit, companies or media companies have recreated, for example, the Seinfeld apartment, the inside of Central Park, and invited fans to these places to they're putting out they're putting out merchandise or they're advertising a shift from one platform to another. And so for promotion for that, they'll invite fans to visit these places, and they're packed. Fans want to sit in Jerry's apartment. They want to go to Central Perk. They want to visit these places. And probably the greatest example of this, of course, are theme parks who rake in millions of dollars every year because of nostalgia, because of fictional place nostalgia. For example, Harry Potter's world, obviously fictional, and fictional story with fictional characters or whatnot, but both those who read and or watched the films, these are very important places to them, even though they're fictional. And so to provide a place where people could go and experience these things, uh, is a very profitable business, very profitable for these amusement park companies that do this. So media can remind us of fictional places. Media can also remind us of real people in our lives. So, for example, someone I interviewed about their watching said that watching reruns of MASH reminded him of both his father and stepfather, who were both in the military, who he really loved them both very much, and they both had passed away. And watching MASH was something he did to remind him of them, and he watched it fairly regularly. Uh, and so we can watch shows that remind us of individuals, even if obviously these characters are not real in the sense that they're really happened, but or they really existed, but they carry like that referentiality I talked about earlier. There's a reference you make to them. There's a ring of truth to a person in your life. In this case, he was his both his father and stepfather were in the military, and that provided that referentiality. They were overseas. I think at least one of them was in Korea, and so there was this referentiality that it just there formed that connection. So media can remind us certainly of real people, and then media can remind us of fictional characters. And so perhaps you've heard of parasocial phenomenon, and this is our virtue of parasocial phenomenon, or the one-sided relationships viewers build with characters. And so, fictional characters are seen many times as friends or aspirational figures when we develop a parasocial relationship with them through parasocial interaction. So watching anime in this case, in my example, we can develop even with fictional characters, even with cartoon characters, you might say we can develop parasocial relationships with them because we're interacting with them via media, uh, and that parasocial interaction eventually can lead to a relationship. And then again, for example, another person I interviewed felt nostalgic about anime characters that she grew up watching. So she would rewatch the anime from her childhood because especially I can't remember this one character that she was particularly fond of, and she looked up to her in her childhood because she was strong and independent, and it helped her both then and even as an adult, thinking back and watching these shows. This is not meant to replace, it's not like, it's like my repeat watching dissertation. I wanted to say, I didn't say this, but I wanted to say, a therapist is not going to say, go watch 2 episodes of The Office and call me in the morning. This is not a replacement to therapy. Social surrogacy doesn't replace that kind of intense type of thing. But for everyday issues that people encounter where we feel disconnected or we feel lonely, we feel isolated, or we may just need there's a lot I can get into a lot more stuff here about the social benefits of nostalgia, rewatching all that kind of stuff. I won't go there, but there's a lot there, but it doesn't, if there's a true issue that needs therapy, it's not a replacement for that, obviously. But again, media can remind us of fictional characters that we have developed a parasocial relationship with. And then media can remind us of real events that happen in our lives. This slide I actually used in my dissertation. I really like the slide because I like the quote from Andy Bernard from The Office, and it really ties into the overall message of The Office, which is it is in the small moments that you don't feel like, this is my paraphrase, in the small moments of life where you don't feel like anything special. When you look back, you realize how special it was. And this is over and over again. This was the theme throughout The Office. And just the quote I'll read, but it says, "I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them." And what a tremendous quote about nostalgia. What a terrific quote. And it is, as I said, it was kind of the through line of the whole show. That this everyday office, there could be such an important meaning being made each day and remembrance of how good it was. And this is, of course, him reflecting in the final episode about how good it was for him and now having moved on to a different job. And that's kind of how it is. You long, there's a bittersweet longing to return to that place or that time or that relationship or that whatever the case may be. And so there are events that are unique in our lives, but that we share with mediated characters that might trigger nostalgia. For example, and they're unique to you. So moving to a big city, if that was emotionally balanced for you, like positive or negatively, that might be something that you would share with someone with a character on a television show or movie, or starting a job or a relationship milestone. Either starting a relationship or ending a relationship or somewhere in between, getting married, getting engaged, whatever. All of these different events, having a child, all these different big life events where there can be, a lot of emotion, excuse me, both either positive or negative, it can produce nostalgia as we watch it unfold on a TV screen, in a movie, where fictional people go through similar events, either humorously or dramatically or whatever, and it may trigger our nostalgia for these events. It's important to realize that you can be, and this is one of the crazy things that needs to be studied more, certainly. You can be nostalgic over something that you have not experienced, uh, or something that is untrue. This is where I say sometimes nostalgia is a liar, but I think that that's kind of a misnomer. I maybe shouldn't say that anymore. It doesn't really lie per se, but again, as I said, it involves imagination. And we can lead ourselves to thinking and believing things that either are untrue or based on nostalgia over things that haven't happened. So, like in my example of the interviewee I had that said he watched MASH to be close, he felt a closeness to both his father and stepfather. And he was never in the Korean War, but he feels a very close relationship with people who have done that or have been in the army, and whatnot. He's never been in the army himself, but we can remember things that aren't quite exactly the case or aren't quite exactly true. And nostalgia, as we said, is powerful. It is very powerful, as I said, amusement parks that build um, media either rides or whole parks based on some sort of media product, rake in millions of dollars based off people's nostalgia, but also in a very stark example, and everybody has different views or what have you, but in a very stark example, in politics, you have Donald Trump campaign, both his first run and now this run. He's running on this rhetoric called "Make America Great Again." Well, it's rhetoric, but it's also designed to elicit nostalgia from his base, and because his base refer to the good old days, the people he's referring to in his base. He doesn't mind, obviously does not mind alienating a good chunk of the American people who don't think America was as great as maybe is what he is projecting in that piece of rhetoric. If he doesn't care about alienating, he wants to speak to his base, and he says, "Well, make America great again," referring to, well, if this allows people to narratively self-reference themselves in the past. Well, it was better because of this. It was better because of that. Blah 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 blah. Uh, not caring about or not coming into not realizing or not admitting there is a good chunk of Americans for which America was not all that great and still isn't that great, and for a variety of different reasons. Nostalgia can be very powerful and moving people through because it's about emotion, as I said, and so we have to be careful, both in political advertising and just advertising in general. And last but not least, this is something in addition to all the other ones. I'll just mention it quickly here. I found that merchandise from media can remind us of anything that we discussed. Merchandise from media can also be a reminder, can also elicit nostalgia. The example I gave earlier of the woman who referred to the anime that she watched when she was younger. A big part of that was she got a lot of anime toys, even through childhood, teenage years into adulthood, and more individuals into adulthood are getting these, I'll say, toys or just representations of the media that they prefer. I mean, even in my own family, my daughter knows what I like, and she'll give me Office stuff, or Parks and Rec stuff, and more and more people will have these things. And Mel Brooks said it best in the 1987 movie Spaceballs, merchandising, where the real money from the movie is made. And this is so true. It's an open secret in Hollywood that merchandising drives the creation and longevity of many projects. This is why Marvel is so successful. They start with the toy first, frankly. With all of these projects, the toys, they market the toys first. They create the toys first, then they create the movie, then they sell the movie. This is because selling merch provides a large chunk of the revenue, of course, and in some cases, most of the revenue, the majority of the revenue. This coupled with co-branding. So, for example, Beetlejuice just came out, and they co-branded with Progressive and CarMax. So you'll see, like in Progressive and CarMax commercials, you'll see Beetlejuice co-branded with them. And this is not new. So, like McDonald's used to have their toys co-branded with various movies that came out and all that kind of stuff. And this has to do with contagion theory. Contagion theory was first applied to religious artifacts that asserts that people attach meaning to objects that have religious significance. And so, what Gabriel and colleagues did with social surrogacy, which involves nostalgia, reminders of others, they were able to kind of connect that to these various products that become representations of characters and shows and movies that we enjoy, that we take home with us. And we have these things, in our office, in our house somewhere, and different places, and it reminds us. It carries a little bit of the ethos of the movie, of the emotion attached to the movie, and it embodies a character or part of the movie that we enjoy. Again, connects us to our own self concept, and these reminiscences produce a kind of a social surrogacy. And so, as we said, nostalgia is a complex construct. It works through our memory and imagination through narrative self-referencing to edit highly balanced positive and negative emotional stimuli. This is all done to support our self-concept, to keep us consistent with ourselves. This makes us feel good. And this is one of the reasons why nostalgia feels good. Even though it's a bittersweet process, there's always part of a bitter to it because we're not there. We want to get back to a certain feeling. We want to get back to a certain place. We want to get back to a certain, whether it's fictional, whether it's real or whatever. But that's the sweet part of it, is we feel like ourselves. We feel consistent with ourselves. And so again, regarding media, nostalgic reminiscences can come in the form of real place nostalgia, fictional place nostalgia, real person nostalgia, fictional person nostalgia, event nostalgia, nostalgia triggered by merchandise related to a media project. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Josh. Do you have a few more minutes if anyone has questions?
Oh yeah, sure.
And have questions, comments for Josh?
I thought it was really interesting to, start with that whole how nostalgia has to do with our identity, because the thing that comes up most for me as an example of how people deal with nostalgia is, there's for some media franchises they have different generations, and I see a very constant thing. It's like, oh, but this isn't like how it was when I was a kid. This one is no good. I don't want this. And I see this with multiple generations. I see this like especially with some of the like the more children's oriented stuff. Like people complain about every new generation of like My Little Pony, Care Bears, Teen Titans, even like Marvel and DC superheroes. And so it was really interesting to bring up how nostalgia ties in with consistency in our identity as kind of maybe an explanation for why people are so enthusiastic about that because kind of like this rebelling against this new generation of something that was very prominent of their own childhood identity. They might just like be struggling to maintain that consistency with it changing and with like their generation of it kind of starting to fade from from like the forefront of cultural consciousness.
Yeah, and that's a terrific point. Because yeah, as they update these new franchises and these new either products or whatever, and so it's kind of a crossover with consumer psychology and marketing. Marketing and branding is all about identity. And so movies and franchises and such, in order to brand, in order to market their media products, of course, you're saying they update them. And this is so important for all brands. We don't think of it in the terms of media in the sense of television movies because the um, the characters of a show we grew up with are the characters of the show we grew up with, and to have them change that, like you're saying, there's something wrong with that. We feel violated, uh, but a newer generation looks at it and connects with it a different way because their identity is different. The cultural mores have changed, and as a result, their identity is different. So it hits them different. And so these are very successful, to which the older generation replies, you know, uh, that's not my, whatever the product is or whatever the media is, that's not my show, that's not my movie. I much prefer the older one. And so, yeah, so why are there so many remakes in Hollywood or what have you? This is one of the reasons, because they're rebranding so that newer generations can identify with their products via their products, meaning, their characters and their storylines. They're updating the characters and storylines so that, it is ultimately about money, of course, so they can sell them, so that people buy tickets, people buy merchandise and everything. But yeah, that's what the necessity for all the remakes. Great point.
I have a question kind of tacked on to that a little bit. So you were talking about like locations, and that had me thinking about like Sleepy Hollow, right? That was originally a story that was kind of a legend, but people knew about the place, and now it's a TV show. And so we have stuff like that in our culture that were like originally written stories, but they've kind of transcended into media and they're almost ingrained. And with superheroes, you could almost argue the same because comic books kind of came out and had real locations before movies. So what are your thoughts on that? Like the evolution of written word that sometimes hit us as stories and then has continued and transcended.
Yeah, so a great example of that is a more recent example, I guess, would be Harry Potter, where it started off as a set of books and then it went into this really just mega movie and uh, brand of, like I said, a place to go to, amusement park and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so there's transferring it's not really transmedia because it's telling the same story, but going from one media like in books to a different media, you're going to get, so I think a certain amount of people, it's going to turn off from going to books to movies. They say, well, the book is always better or the movie's always better, you're not going to get. But I think with Harry Potter you saw like a mass migration of all those who read the books, watched the film, and it just became that much more, like I said, balanced. Like the emotion we're talking about emotions, and those who maybe weren't exposed to the books got a chance to also narratively self-reference themselves in that story. And so you had the explosion of just not just now the ones that, I mean, the books were super popular, but then now also the films, even more so. And you had the expansion of their fan base, moving from books to film, and now, and also they not only that, of course, they did uh experiment with transmedia storytelling where they would pick out different characters or whatever and tell different stories original show. They went down different roads and experimented with different characters doing different things. But the basic idea is you go back to they see elements of themselves, they see elements of this idea of referentiality. And so as long as the referentiality is there from book to um, screen, you're gonna have people cross over and they're gonna want to see the screen adaptations, and you're gonna see new fans going to see the film. One of for uh in recent history, one example of something that could have went really wrong for the studio and the author. So I read Lee Child Jack Reacher books, and back in the day, they contracted for the original Reacher movies was played by Tom Cruise, who is nothing like, if you read the Reacher books, he looks nothing like Jack Reacher from the books, but it's Tom Cruise. It's, superstar and what have you. And the movies did fairly well, despite that. But there was an undercurrent among the fans that said, this is not who Jack Reacher is. We're not going to watch the movie. But for that one, it worked out okay. Still made quite a bit of money. But now there's a Reacher television show on Prime where he is much more like the character in the book. Ben Affleck, who took over the Batman franchise, there was a huge backlash when he took over, because they said, we don't want this Hollywood A-lister playing Batman. He's not right for the character. It was a huge backlash. And so you always have to, it's all about identity. Going back to what I said, it's all about who we identify with, how we identify with it. Um, and it's all relative to nostalgia, because nostalgia has to constantly keep editing, and the fans did not want to have to include Ben Affleck in the in that canon of self-reflection. They did not want to have that. And so there was, I think it still made quite a bit of money, but there was a large contingent of fans who did not want that to happen. And so this is what, kind of movie companies deal with when they decide to adapt a book. I don't think it diminishes, I guess, to the point, I don't think it diminishes adapting. I think you have to be careful dealing with, and again, these are all, it's the psychology of it. I don't think so much executives worry about so much. They worry about putting people in the seats. They worry about ticket sales. They worry about the merchandising and all that kind of stuff, which sometimes they make the right decisions, and sometimes they don't.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate this. I'm sure the class does as well. We have a few students who aren't able to join today who are really looking forward to the recording.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And it's my pleasure. So long, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and take about a 2-minute break, and then we'll continue with our normal discussion. So we'll meet back here a little longer. We'll meet back here at 3:50 Pacific time, which is in 4 minutes. All right. Everyone enjoy that? It's a great topic, and Josh is so good at presenting on it. He also just did his FOR for his dissertation, which was around nostalgia is one of the factors in TV rewatching. So if you're interested, you can always reach out to him and learn more. Okay, we're going to switch gears a bit and talk about our chapter for this week in the articles. So this week we really focused on actors and their roles. I'm going to drop the discussion questions into the chat here. All right, and then we have a couple folks who haven't been able to join before, so just a reminder for ground rules, it's gonna be open discussion. We can start with one of the prompts or any questions or things anyone wants to bring up. We'll also spend some time having you all talk about the author's notebook entries you did. In order to get credit, all you need to do is actively participate in the session. Would anyone like to kick us off with one of our prompts?
Can I throw a wrench into the system? Because we were talking about the idea of having this character who is a person. So we've got them. We've also got the character that they're playing, like on a movie or a show. I was thinking about some of the books. Like I brought up Bridgerton earlier because they do like the Bridgerton balls, and my wife's really into Bridgerton whenever it comes out. But then there's that concept of those were also books. So we've got books. We've got the characters as they're portrayed in the movie or the television show, which is somewhat different than the character in the book, and then the actor. And so, with that question about, someone coming up to an actor and going, "Hey, like you as this character, what would you do with this?" And they're like, "I'm not that person. Like I play that part." But we kind of assume that they have those attributes. They are that character in addition to themselves. But I'm wondering if it even goes beyond that. Because I know my wife constantly will bring up, she'll be like, "Well, in the book, they did this." And I'm wondering if the actors ever get asked that question in coordination with assuming that they would know the character in the book and go, "Well, in the book, you did this. But in the movie, the show you did this. Like, why is that different?" And this poor actor being like, I don't know. I didn't write this thing." So I'm wondering if there's even like a third step to this.
I mean, just jumping off that, my brain goes to just like, are we able to separate the art from the artist? Right. And I have a hard time doing that. Like, I'm not gonna lie, with all the stuff coming out with like the musicians and hip hop and all of like P. Diddy stuff, like my entire music of my childhood is gonna be no longer, available to me. I mean, I can listen to it, but I'm gonna have moral conflict listening to, Mo Money, Mo Problems, but that's a jam. And that really reminds me of my youth. And so same thing with actors. Like we see now that people are being held accountable for their trash behavior. And it's affecting not only, I'm sure, sales and all that and their reputation and all that, but where's that line? Like, are you able to do a job, whether it's an actor or an accountant or anywhere in between, and be whatever kind of person you want and still get that paycheck? But is it different for actors? Because they do have these characters and they are playing on human emotions. Like my CPA, if he turns out to be an asshole, I'm not going to be really mad about it. But like all these rumors about Beyonce coming out, I'm devastated, And so like, why? What's the difference? Is because there's an emotional connection there. Her songs make me feel a certain way, elicit emotions within myself, I'm sure. So same things with actors and movies. I personally don't get too like for some reason with actors and stuff, I'm able to separate the art from like reality. Like I don't really get absorbed in things like to that nature, like TV and things like that. But when it comes to music and stuff, I absolutely do. But I think it's just that emotional connection that drives it all. And if you want, I can get us started on another prompt, because I was reading the second one about talking about why we are attracted to and remember the beautiful people of Hollywood based on what you read in the chapter. And I find it interesting, as I was reading, there was a concept I never heard of before called mate value. And apparently it's been around forever. But it's basically it says that, attractiveness plays a big role in how we value mates. And I just wonder if that's true for any of y'all. Personally, I don't necessarily, I mean, I love to look at, a lovely person, but that's a subjective experience, I think. And like, I'm not one that really is about physical attractiveness. I'm more about the content of one's character and things like that. You can look however you want to me, and I will just look at you as a human. And so I just wonder if anybody else has like experiences of like, you know, the attractiveness factor or your mate value or whatever. I mean, I'm a perpetually single woman too. I don't believe in love. I think it's a social construct. So this whole thing of like mate value, I'm like, okay, you're pretty cute, but you could be trash. So
I want to say I read the perceiving and experiencing fictional characters article, and when I was reading that, I was like, oh my gosh, they're talking about this attractiveness thing in the whole chapter for like the actors and stuff like that. But they bring it up as like the importance of the initial, like they call it encoding. There's like 3 steps to like getting obsessed with some character or the actor or whatever. But they're basically saying that it's a big component of like your initial wanting to like relate to this character or get to know more about them, and it's tied to like how attractive they are physically as well as like morally, like are they aligned with some of the stuff that you want, just to kind of lure you in like from the very beginning. And so then when reading through the chapter, I was like, oh, there, that's the whole thing that they're saying with all these actors. And just, I think that's kind of like the way that we first identify with them. Because if you click on, you were going through, like we were talking about the Netflix things, and you're like, I'm not going to watch that one. Look at the next one. But if you initially see something, you're like, oh, well, I'll listen for a minute here because like the picture's pretty. And then at least it gets that initial hook in.
So I kind of think about the way that it describes the initial kind of like grab of the attention, kind of like the stages of love in the brain. And when we first recognize someone as attractive, it's actually dopamine. We get a hit of dopamine to pursue, right? Because it's like go. But when you actually find a mate long term and you're thinking about, down the road, oxytocin, vasopressin, and serotonin start to get released, right? So the chemicals being released in our body long term when we're actually faced with a potential mate are very different than the initial chemicals that are flooding our system when we go, ooh, pretty. And when you think about like Instagram, Facebook, like short content media, it often is based on the same kind of principle, which is how do you get the person's initial attention and you get the dopamine hit and the dopamine hit and the dopamine hit. So so I think it's complicated. And it's not just actors. You see it with musicians and you see it with athletes, right? Where often there's a lot and I think that that's potentially that like dopamine pursuit hit is a part of why we might sometimes get confused with that's someone who's performing. I would liken it to anyone who performs, and I would even put athletes up there because that's a performance, right? Like we're seeing them and we're seeing them perform in a way that we know that they have value in society. They're sought after. And that could drive our pursuit hormones, our pursuit desires, but that's very different. For most people, they can disentangle that from their what is love, right? What's that, those long-term feels that we tend to get. So I don't know, that's kind of my thoughts on that.
I found the discussion of scanning in the chapter very interesting because I think as an African American, I have been a victim of scanning. I remember when I first got my MA as an IO psychologist, I went into the convenience store, and this woman said, "Oh, look at her. She's a psychologist." And this is all in group. And they said, "Oh, she ain't look like no psychologist." So scanning, as discussed in the chapter, is when people form an initial impression of you, is something that is really interesting and something that people can often be wrong. But people do have a perception of what certain people, this is how a doctor should look. This is how a psychologist should look. And they even have a shirt that they'll sell you, or used to. If you joined APA, they would sell you a shirt that says, "This is what a psychologist looks like," because they can look anyway. And I remember riding to a conference one time, and I saw this man on a motorcycle with his little things, and he was going to the same conference I was going to. So scanning, but you would never know. But scanning is a very interesting concept, as discussed in the chapter, about how we perceive people, but we really don't know, but people do it.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but Liv, I think you brought up a good point too about, you mentioned the in-group, right? A lot of times we think about stereotypes coming from people who are outside of our groups, when often they actually come from within our groups as well, right? So as individuals, we face pressure to conform or to be a certain way, not just from people who are different from us, but people who perceive themselves to be similar to us. So just had to acknowledge that good point you made. How about the next prompt about the actor role identity problem related to what we read about the Property Brothers and other sets of twins? What do you all think?
I found the part about them, like, even getting down to their wardrobe and like presenting one brother as one way and one brother wearing other things, just so the audience can differentiate, who is who between them. Because I mean, I grew up with the Olsen twins and I still can't tell you who's who, And so it's just one of those, like, I think, because I feel like they did talk about them in that chapter too. I actually texted my friend. I was like, guys, I'm reading about the Olsen twins in my PhD program. And then one of my friends was like, they wrote that they sang and danced. That's a little bit of a stretch, but that was the only feedback we got, because I don't think they're very known for being very good singers. But either way, I think it's interesting, the identity of, because those are also the Property Brothers. They're more reality, right? So these are also human beings attached, and so there is different personality traits that are probably being exploited by producers to differentiate the two. Because why pay for two when you only need one? So from a production point, they could just have one of them and cut half the costs of that host who's ever qualified. But having two, making sure you differentiate the two and make them more of a team rather than replaceable, I think is key.
I'm wondering if the like the Mary Kate Ashley thing, they were in that role from the time they were kids and then like grew up with that role. So even thinking like Daniel Radcliffe, like he for so many people is Harry Potter, like that's just who he is. So I'm wondering with like kids like that, if their perception of themselves versus their character is different than people who like William Shatner. Like we see him as an adult, like he gets older, but he's still like as an adult. But is there like a difference for those child actors that becomes like them, like Taylor Lautner from Twilight? Like I knew him when he was a little kid, and he was like Shark Boy, so we would just call him Shark Boy. We're like, hey Shark Boy, like, and that was like who he was in a way, even with people that we knew him like in real life. And so it's like is that the same for like some of the actors that already have a sense of who they are as a person before they became this character versus kids that grew up as that character, and is that like actually part of them?
Interesting. I've actually been thinking about a similar thing because these actors, they choose their roles. right? So some of them tend to choose similar roles. And I wonder if it's a subconscious attempt to keep that identity in other, the watcher's perspective. And also, like Daniel Radcliffe, like you said, I've been thinking about the same thing about Justin Bieber after the recent DD drama. There are some people, for example, cannot accept the fact that Justin Bieber is a, I don't know, 30, how old he is? 30 something year old man now. But they still perceive him as this, 15-year-old kid. And now that there are news about how he might have been abused, it is more of an emphasis to his identity, that 15-year-old kid. So yeah, that's it.
Talking about what you mentioned before about how actors choose their role, that's kind of just an assumption because that assumption was also discussed in the Tuga Tukachinsky article, where part of the reason that people have such a problem with like that kind of incongruence or dissonance between actors and the characters they play is because they assume that actors will have full control over who they choose to play. But that's not always true. There's a long history. You're going to find actors who have a certain role that they hated, and maybe they were just contracted to play. Like what first comes to mind for me is Robert Pattinson. Absolutely hated Edward Cullen. Absolutely hated the Twilight series, and yet that is something that that was an image that he was stuck with. And even now, people are still surprised by his range as an actor because of how impactful his image in Twilight was. So and he's not the only one. Like Rachel Zegler kind of went viral for her interview where she's saying like she doesn't exactly love the character or story of Snow White. She's doing this for a check, and that is a reality in the film and television industry. It's hard to find work that pays well. Means not necessarily always taking these roles that really resonate with you. So I guess I guess this also kind of like relates to that first prompt because like sure that we still kind of all work with that assumption that somehow this actor is going to be a little bit like their character. Like would you really want to even pretend to be like someone that you wouldn't even really like in real life? So I guess in some places it might also like bleed out into the work. Like Twilight, people look back on it and they like it, but not necessarily because it was really good or written well. They like it for other reasons. So I don't know if maybe like the knowledge of that kind of incongruence also can affect narrative transportation. And I guess to kind of like continue that point, relating to that first prompt again about like how and why people have trouble kind of separating art from the artist sometimes, especially I see this with live action media. Like someone already mentioned, like Daniel Radcliffe having a terrible time trying to get away from his Harry Potter role. Like if a story is done well, if that narrative transportation is happening, then like part of the whole point is that it feels real, that character feels real, and if the actor is doing their job, it really should feel like they really are that character. But then kind of like making that switch back to real life, if the narrative translation is that good, that's where some of that difficulty can happen in kind of like separating them from their role.
Anna, you just had me thinking of a funny little anecdote. So Los Angeles, that's where I live. If you are on any dating apps, you will come across a lot of like actors, right? Who have played like the perpetrator on Law and Order or like in the crime shows. I'm like, I'm not going to go on a date with you because I know who you are in relationships. And I saw you beat that girl that one time in episode 3. And like, he's probably a very nice person, but my initial reaction is you're a perpetrator and you have been convicted in a court of law. Mariska Hargitay took you out. Detective Benson came to your house. So no. So I do find it like, even just like living in Los Angeles, sometimes these lines are like really blurred and it's a really weird thing to see. Like I'll watch a commercial and my friend Mark's in it, because he's an actor. And it's just like, it's just this weird line. And even when Josh was in here earlier talking about the settings and the, you know, like Universal Studios, it's where Harry Potter land is and stuff like that, the backlot tour of all these sets and scenery. And it's like, I had my prom back there. And so like, for me, it's nostalgic because it reminds me of being in high school and like having my prom on that backlight, not connecting to necessarily the shows that were in that backdrop. So I think that's kind of also another interesting level to all of this. Actors, roles is like, where you are, location, and what you're used to. And like, are you used to living in a town where you see movies happening all the time? And maybe it's not this like as transportable experience into that narrative world because it's just like, oh, there's the movie set, there's the grip, there's the prop, there's the light, you know, hanging, there's the cue cards and the sets. So I know that that's my experience. And so it kind of disconnects me in a way from fully, I think, becoming absorbed in these things just because of where I live and kind of what I see all the time.
Interesting. Or vice versa. I know some people that will not watch a show because they don't like the main character. They're not gonna let themselves yeah, get lost in the story because they just don't like the actor. I've been begging my friend to watch Fleabag. They won't. They won't watch it because they don't like the character. It's a great show.
To bounce off what you said, I remember seeing a recent post, Jesse, that it was like of Ashley Tisdale saying how she grew up on the same street as all of these other child actors and how they would just were neighbors and they would just like get up, get ready, go to work and something they'd spend the night and everything. And then also what William said, just like the difference between uh, like child actors and then actors that start later in life, you know, the influence of long-term roles. I think of Ariana Grande a lot of like the Nickelodeon stars too. If you guys saw that one documentary on HBO Max. But the book said that, you know, actors would adopt certain traits about their characters, and there's a lot of things on media like making fun of Ariana Grande and like her little voice thing that she does. And I don't know, I feel like I've caught myself doing those voice things like you know, you are a different person and you have different personalities and you use different vocals sometimes. And she like grew up playing Cat on Victorious, so I don't know why people make fun of her, but yeah, that reminded me of those two media situations with actors.
Well, on top of all this, this also makes me think of, because I always go to reality TV, right? And like I'm in the true crime genre. That's kind of where my like meat and potatoes are. And it gets me thinking about the roles that are created by the media and these people. And like two people come up in particular. One is Casey Anthony, who was like, you know, accused and convicted of murdering her child. And it became a big case. And people to this day still, you know, it really rake her through the coals on social media and things like that. And then I think of someone like Amanda Knox, who was accused but acquitted, but still has that legacy tied to her. And I've had the chance to meet with her and kind of discuss her experience. And it's really phenomenal what this role that was created of this, you know, girl who killed her roommate in Italy, and it was like this big thing in movies. And I mean, it was like a huge obsession for our culture in true crime, and just how that continues to be her legacy, and everything she will do from here on out will be that. I mean, even if you type your own name into her own name into Google, that's what's going to come up. Like, and so now she's channeling a new career into broadcast journalism and like things like that, and trying to turn it around. But it's really powerful also for the people who are at that center. I think a lot of times we can look at these actors or people like that you know, a little arbitrarily, and because they're kind of disconnected, but like those are real human beings, and like they need groceries and like use toilet paper like the rest of us. And so like being in that position, although yes, they chose that career, but some of them didn't necessarily, but like it's a hard position to be in, and resources for those people is limited, or even the ability to just connect with other people once you're up there. It's such a just a weird existence.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point with that thing. We always forget like the real people with those everyday problems. And I mean, even with like this chapter where they were saying we tend to see their character, and then whatever like their personality is like as the character, we attribute like that's who they are as a character, as an actual person. Like if they're really friendly, they're really nice, like that's who they are. Or if they're an ass and they're terrible and they're the sexual predator, like you're like, I'm not dating you because of that. And so you don't know them from Adam, but we're still kind of like transferring that across and saying this is kind of who you are. You have those same emotions, motives, and everything as that character, even though they're like, I'm just trying to get my groceries. Like I want to go on a date on Friday night. But they don't get to be that person.
Kind of like carrying that over because I grew up around athletes, so not and so you could have someone who is mid-range on a team that's somewhat known, and like the sweetest guy who would, like, I was a kid, so would hold my diaper bag, right? But then you could end up with someone who people would think was like this great person, but total, not gonna hold the diaper bag, right? But I think some of them, there's this fear of falling, because you've been built up to be a winner, or there's so much pressure to be whatever the personality is in the scene that you're in. And I think that happens with actors too, and even on a smaller scale. So like we think of mega blockbuster actors, but I work with community-based agencies, and we do a lot of coaching on like local sustainability planning with local media, and how to have participants from your programs come forward and give their stories. But what we also talk about, and I'm a big person with this, is being careful that they don't get so big that it hinders their recovery, right? Because oftentimes agencies will want to have a poster child for their program. And while that's not national or global level, box office busting, people know you. When you are a local figure, or you're known in certain circles, it can give you, just when you want to go out to the diner, right? It can put some pressure on you to act a certain way. And even in certain professions, I've found that, like, in the nonprofit world, we have to often sign, or we get very strong talkings about how our social media presence has to be, or we can get terminated, because we have to have a certain persona that's seen by everyone around us. And I know for teachers, it's the same thing out in school districts. There are certain things that you have to cultivate a personality. You have to cultivate a role as far as online, and that's seeping not just into like celebrities and people on a big level. That's just every day now for a lot of roles that are seen as in mentor type figures, or just respected to a certain degree in the community. So I think that that's kind of an interesting transition that's happened over the last decade or less, when it comes to everyone almost playing a role in life.
Yeah, I like the point about cultivating the role. It makes me think of that one Friends episode where Joey's out on a date and the girl suddenly looks at him and is like, oh, oh, and she's like turns around and leaves. And he's like, what's going on? He turns around and looks, and on the subway wall, there's just like millions of posters, and it says, what is Mario not telling you? And it's his picture, and it says syphilis underneath it.
I can discuss the last one. You see a famous actor seated at a table. You know they played a famous role. Pick any example. you like. Discuss who the person is you're seeing and where the character is following the discussion in chapter 3. Well, the person that I'm going to see is Jean-Luc Picard, and I'm going to see him in a French restaurant, eating French bread, drinking wine, and I'm going to watch him the whole time, and he's going to get tipsy, and he's going to start talking about how experienced he is and how sophisticated he is and the women he's known and just how he's the man of the world. So that's my perception of Jean-Luc and how I take him over to, real life. And I just could not see Jean-Luc not being that way. I even have Jean-Luc on my Christmas tree. I really like Jean-Luc.
Has anyone had the experience of meeting a celebrity in person? And well, Jesse, I know you just mentioned a couple well-known people that you've obviously met, but any like fictional entertainment celebrities, and you were a bit surprised by their real life personality?
I met Oprah, and she was a lot more chill than I thought she was going to be. She was just very business and matter of fact. She was lovely, but I wanted her to be like, Oprah, but she just had to get some business done. But she was nice. But yeah, it was one of those like, oh, the bubble popped a little bit.
Had an interesting experience where a couple of years I worked as a PA for the Emmys because I had a friend who worked for the TV Academy, and so I just came along for the weekend and did all the grunt work. And so I met Oprah and like all these people. We were positioned backstage, so you bring the presenters and winners off and take them over to do their next interviews. I had like the whole Game of Thrones cast, the Schitt's Creek cast, all of these. And what was so interesting to me is I had that moment with some of them where you think you know them, but then just in a couple minutes of interaction, they're such a different person than you see on screen. And of course, there's some people who are closer than others. Like if anyone watches Schitt's Creek, or I mean, Catherine O'Hara's known for many other things too, but she has a very chill but funny personality in person, while she tends to play very heightened characters. Um, Kristen Bell was not as nice as I thought she would be. But again, we form these impressions of people based off of the characters we play, and then it can be jarring when we experience them in a situation where they don't act that way. And that was part of too, with the office study that Josh talked about as well, and you all read in the first week, is part of that fan experience, right? Is that they assume that John Krasinski and Jenna Fisher have these same qualities and feelings and beliefs as their characters, which is part of the reason that we have that fuzzy disconnect about them knowing other people in real life, right? And again, sometimes these are very subconscious thoughts. All right, I'll pass it to Kat.
I was just gonna say, I know politicians, and so I would say the politicians that I know and work with, they're a lot more subdued, away from things, and they are almost more human. So I get to see them talk about their passion projects outside of like passing this or that. And so it's really cool to actually, and maybe it's just because the politicians that I do know work in the they care about the nonprofit sector, so they're naturally more driven towards that kind of behavior. But I would say in general, they're a lot chiller and calmer and softer spoken than what tends to be portrayed.
So I've never met any like television or film stars really. It's mostly been like musical theater stars, and again still a very small handful. And I was like just thinking, I don't think I really had that issue. And I think it's because like the way that things are done on stage versus on film and television is very different. Television and film, they use a lot of camera work to force your perspective and to kind of like keep up that illusion like this is real. this is all real. These are who these people are. Whereas with like stage, like theater and on stage, there is more of like that switch that's happening in front of you because the actors come out and take their bows, and in that moment they're not like they're in the dress of their characters, but they're no longer performing as their characters, and they're taking credit for their work done as a character. And I think that does help. And that's not to say that there isn't potential for that sort of like same parasocial relationship in musical theater fandoms, because like I do see that, but I think it's like not definitely not to the degree that you would have with film and television, because there's that switch and separation that's happening right in front of your eyes.
My experience is like the exact opposite because I grew up doing like extreme martial arts and like all the flipping, and so a bunch of the people that I like did stuff with went into acting and all moved to LA, and so I knew a lot of them way before they became actors. And so I have like the opposite thing where I'm like, that's not who you are, like when I see them on the TV. So for me, that's like the opposite disconnect, or in some cases I'm like, no, that's totally like who you are. um and so like for me, like thinking about it the other way, I didn't run into any other actors other than ones that like I knew when they were little. So um yeah.
So there was one time I was working for HBO Comic Relief, and it's like a fundraiser back in the day that was like Robin Williams, Whoopi Goldberg, and Billy Crystal. And like Whoopi Goldberg, like Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit is one of my hands down favorites. And I was carrying someone's costume down below. And the theme, this was in 2006, and it was to benefit Hurricane Katrina. So the theme was like New Orleans. And Whoopi Goldberg is in this like tail feather costume, right? With feathers and things and like a Mardi Gras moment. And so I'm holding this costume and I'm going down this hallway, and it is small, and I see her and I'm over here and I'm like, oh my God, this is my queen. I got to say something. She's in tail feathers. And so I was like, as I'm passing by, I'm like, excuse me, Whoopi, I didn't want to rustle any tail feathers. And she just looked at me and she goes, oh, honey, and walked away. And I was like, that was, I mean, the timing. She's literally wearing tail feathers, and the comic queen didn't think that was funny. And it like really hurt my feelings.
All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the articles from this week. So we had 3 different articles. I'll just briefly summarize, or not summarize, but just highlight the articles that you chose from. So one option was Talor and Papperman, which is the fundamental attribution error in attributing fictional figures' characteristics to the actors. And that is actually one that was cited in the Office paper, because within this concept of person perception, which we read about in the chapter, the whole idea of person perception is we make attributions about ours and others. And the biggest mistake we typically make is attributing someone's being to themselves rather than to their environment. So in the case of actors, we're seeing someone put into a situation, but our brain is still processing what they're doing as if it's self-motivated rather than contextual. The second option was the Horn and Koningen, and I'm probably not saying those names right, about perceiving and experiencing fictional characters. And they built an integrated model of how all that fits together. And then the last one was from Riva Tukachinsky, who is actually our guest editor for the Office article. You're noticing a theme here. And this one is also along the same lines of when actors don't walk the talk. So really exploring the ways in which we perceive actors and form parasocial relationships with them and how that contrasts to who they really are as a person. All right, so with that in mind, who would like to kick us off talking about the article they read and giving us some of the key highlights?
I mean, I can just jump in here and get us started if you like. I read the Tukachinsky article, so when actors don't walk the walk, parasocial relationships. And the main points were parasocial relationships. So just basically the emotional connections that we have with kind of one-sided relationships, right? And so there are these relationships with people, but like they don't know you exist, girl. And so the way in which we form those with media personalities, and how those play a major role in how we respond to the incongruence that we see between who they are and maybe what they are. So that actor character incongruence is what they called it. And it's basically the effect on the audience when an actor's personal views conflict with the role that they portray. So they may be playing, I don't know, a villain in one story, but they're, not a villain in real life, or vice versa, or, something along those lines. And then there was a little study in there, and so it was about actor character incongruence. The moderating variable was like the strength of the parasocial relationship. So like if they were, how emotionally connected were these viewers to this actor? And then this was interesting because this took a funky turn for me, because then they started talking about Everybody Loves Raymond and like breast augmentation. And I was like, oh, this is where we're going today. Okay. And so this article was all about kind of this like episode in which Ray's wife is contemplating, getting her boobs done. And the whole kind of episode unfolds around that. And so it kind of used that situation about having cosmetic surgery to evaluate like the character authenticity, also emotional responses, and just like overall enjoyment of like the episode. And so they made the participants watch video clips that was like incongruent and also congruent with the actor character kind of pairings. And then they just took a survey and it assessed their emotional response, how they thought, how authentic it was, and also the level of like parasocial interaction that they had with Raymond. Everybody loves him. But I mean, other than like the findings and things like that, I found that interesting. Like that show is pretty long. It's been around a while. There's a lot of topics that they could have used for this. And I just found it to be interesting that they decided to focus on women's body parts to prove this story. There's so much other things they could have maybe done.
Yeah, I also read that article and I took that more because they were saying that specifically that attitude towards cosmetic surgeries was the easiest to measure, as in, like, they could find an episode that was specifically about that, where, the attitude of the character is clearly illustrated, and then they could just easily manipulate the interview portion to either like align with that or not. So just in terms of like practicality, it made sense to me that it was done. It didn't seem like, very any type of way. And I know like one of the main findings was that like if the viewer had a high parasocial relationship with the actor, it didn't necessarily mean they were going to have maintain those attitudes that are consistent with like the actor's beliefs or with what the narrative was pushing. However, it was like viewers who had a weaker parasocial relationship with the actor that were less persuaded when there was that actor character incongruent. So what that was kind of like showing to me was that like that parasocial relationship with the actor, not with the character, can kind of just like, I don't know, what's the word, kind of overcome that kind of like dissonance between like what the actor believes and what the character believes, just because like their attachment is to the actor and not to the character, if that makes sense.
Let's see. The article I read was perceiving and experiencing fictional characters, an integrative account. And basically what it discussed was a model for evaluating the processes by which consumers become involved with fictional characters. So they stated that there are three ways that can happen. It's called, first of all, through encoding. And encoding would be um, how does the character get into them in the first place? So it might involve, or how do they relate to the characters? So it might involve ethics. Can I relate to this character ethically? Aesthetics. How do they look? Can I relate to them by how they look, the environment they're in, or are they the ideal or the non-ideal when it comes to looking at a character? And it also talked about comparison, but comparison and encoding are different. Encoding is when they just perceive what's happening. So they said, well, Dracula, you may say he's bad. So that's encoding. But then you go to comparison, and that's when they start comparing themselves with a fictional character, which has some characteristics of itself too, which is similarity, which is, are they the same as me? And an interesting thing that they said was individuals with high esteem will look for characters like them. Individuals with low self-esteem will look for characters not like them, but who may create a positive affect within them. So most people, even though that happens, most people still get more involved with fictional characters who share their same demographics. And then there was response. And finally, is how do they respond to all of this? And the one key thing that I wanted to acknowledge between chapter 3 and this article is privacy. And it just made me fascinated with how you can privately relate to somebody, how you can privately pretend to be somebody else. And privacy seemed to be a theme with me when I think I was looking over the chapter. Let me see if I had it. It says one very important aspect of our relationship with fictional characters is they can't pose the kind of threat that people we meet face to face do. And then I was like, oh, that goes back to privacy, the privacy to feel, the privacy to relate. And that just made entertainment seem like just a wonderful genre when you think that you can be anything or anybody uh, in your private self.
Say I read the same article, and another thing, like when it was bringing up those three stages, the encode, compare, respond. One of the ones that was weird for me that I had never thought about was when they're doing the comparison, they were looking at stuff like they looked at involvement and they looked at distance. So involvement was like how like close are you with this character and how involved do you feel? And then they had for distance, it was like, how far do you feel like this character is away from you? So like on a comparison note, they're not like you. But the weird thing is that they said, we assign like positive and negative balances to like things that we're seeing. They could be like good things, bad things. But even if you had like a lot of distance from a character, you might not feel like this involvement with them as much, but you could still at the end of it feel like you appreciated the character. And for me, like it's weird because there's characters that I really like from shows that I feel like I identify with. There's characters from shows that I absolutely hate, but I really appreciate that they're there. And so it's this weird thing where it's like I don't really like the character, but I do like the character. And so I think they were one of the first studies they were talking about that actually measured both, because usually it was like how involved do I feel with the character or which characters annoy the crap out of me. And they were the first one that looked at like, can we have both things at the same time with even the same character? Can you feel like distance from a character but still appreciate them? And so that for like that second part where you're trying to compare yourself to the characters in a narrative, I think was like a point that I hadn't seen anything from anything else that I've read.
Yeah, that similarity was really fascinating because they said that ethically you may not be able to relate to them, but ethically, based on society, you could adjust. Like they gave the example of James Bond, who may be a womanizer and sleeping with somebody's wife, but we still like him because he's fighting for the queen or he's, doing something big. And that was really interesting to me how they discussed, the ethics of it all and the similarity
Yeah, I also read the same article, and I'm glad you brought the distance thing up, and also you live it's you're right about the during the encoding, the first step is the ethics, which is different than when we meet people in real life. We don't really consider them as threats in the first step. So I think that creates that empathizing with characters more than although they're different from us, we feel distant, we don't feel involved with them. We empathize a little bit more because they're not the threat to us. So it was also interesting to see.
Well, and then they brought up the concept of like the in-group, and there was like this weird thing going on with the like if you're part of a group and you like something the rest of the group normally does not like you kind of mask that and try to like hide it a little bit. So they said sometimes they would like ask people like, did you like this movie? And if it's against what the group normally likes for that in group, the person would be like, well, I mean, I guess it was okay. And so they said they would get these like median replies where like it was kind of masking they really really liked it, but they really really wanted to fit in with like their normal group, and so the response was just kind of in the middle. And so they said it was almost deceptive trying to like figure out how people were relating to like different characters or different stories.
That's really interesting. And as an aside, there's this book, it's called Social Psychology, and it's green. I don't remember who it's by, but she says that you have the group and then you have the people who are individuals. And she says the individuals are always more successful than the people who stay in the group. That's very fascinating.
And I think now as our groups are getting bigger, because like you can connect with millions of people that like the same thing as you online, those like subgroups, you can still find people within that larger group. So I'm wondering if that's going to kind of change going forward. Is are there going to be these people that are more willing to speak out because they know they'll find someone somewhere online, there's another 50 of them out of the 10,000 that like this one thing, where in the past, because we were geographically kind of isolated, out of like their in-group, there might not have been another person that liked that same thing or kind of wanted to split away from that larger group in the same way.
Okay, has anyone not shared yet about their author's notebook entry?
I read the attribution error study. It was interesting. It broke down what is attribution error, so that people relating behaviors to inherent to the person versus the situation. And then they did a couple of actual studies where they had participants first read a kind of like a non-emotional, just brief biography of an actor, and then they were split into two groups. One group was shown scenes or clips that showed the actor in a negative way. Another one was shown in a positive way. And so they looked to see, was there a change in opinion, and was there a significance in one versus the other. And then they also ran it where they had the same kind of structure, but then they had four groups. So they had the positive, the negative, and then they had two groups within that same timeline that had a positive and a negative, and they reversed the order to see if the order of exposure when exposed to both clips had a significance in the way that there was the perception of the actor's personality after the fact. And then they said that they didn't really see a significance when there was previous exposure, like when the participant acknowledged previous exposure to the actor before the study. So it was interesting, I think. And the actor did, or not the actor, the researcher did point out that attribution error is something that most people kind of have pop up throughout their life. So it's something that is, it can happen at any time basically to us. And I think other studies have kind of looked at attribution error and said sometimes it can be stress related or focus related. So it's interesting.
Okay, so I know we have a shorter discussion time today since we had our presentation. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions, comments they'd like to bring up related to actors and their roles? Okay, we are going to wrap up here today. For next week, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of having prompts that I will put in to start us off, I'm going to ask everyone to come with a prompt that you will ask the class and get their input on. So I'll send out a little announcement about that as well, but there will be no set prompts, but you need to come with a prompt to ask your classmates. And next week, I'll just talk a couple minutes about what we're getting into next week, which is the mental models of fiction. And that means we're really going to focus a little bit more on the cognitive processes. So overall, we're really talking about the social psychology related to stories, but we're going to talk more about the schemas and scripts that our brain uses to make sense of these story worlds. And what's very interesting, at least from my perspective, is having done the research into a lot of the neural mechanisms, we see that many of the brain areas that process stories are multimodal, meaning that they take in visual information, hearing, scent, everything kind of combines together. So that's why the brain is able to do this, whether you're reading text for a story, whether you're watching a movie, putting on a VR headset, a lot of the processing is done in the same way. So for this week, you'll really get to dig into some of that, and then the article choices are also related to more of that cognitive approach. So there will be plenty of potential topics to come up with for next week's readings. Okay, as usual, I will stay on afterwards in case anyone has any questions or comments. And don't forget that it's almost time for your midterm assignment. So if you want to start thinking about that, we have a couple more weeks leading up till then. So feel free to run topics by me, anything that you'd like. All right, I hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday evenings.
You too. Have a great day.